E aí, pessoal, sejam bem-vindos para mais uma live estudando programação até a vaga de estágio. Então, hoje eu continuar vendo um vídeo aqui que eu tava vendo antes, né? É, nem tava em live, eu, tipo, comecei a estudar o HTML aqui, o CSS na verdade. E, tipo, é isso. Tava treinando fazendo uns botões, ó. Você chega, ele muda, tá ligado? Aí se você segura ele também muda, ó. Uma coisa assim, clica ele muda. Esse aqui tem uma sombrinha. Tipo, aí eu ia praticar, né? Só que como tá muito tarde, eu nem vou. Então eu só vou comer aqui, vendo o vídeo. E é isso. Próxima live provavelmente eu vou praticar. Vou fazer os outros botões lá. E é isso, mano.
HTML skills, such as creating hover effects, other pseudo classes, transitions, and shadows. Here are some more exercises from famous websites that you can try to copy. This time we're also going to copy the hover styles. As always, you can find these solutions and more exercises below the video. In this lesson, we're going to learn about one of the most useful tools for web development called the Chrome DevTools. And we're going to use the DevTools to get perfect colors for our buttons. So first of all, what are the Chrome DevTools? So I find that it's a lot easier to demonstrate it than to try to explain it. So let's go to our website. And we're going to right click in an empty area. And we're going to click Inspect. And this will open up the DevTools. So the cool thing about this is that we can now see all the HTML on our page. If we drill down here, we can see all the buttons. So this is a great way to visualize the HTML as well as the CSS on our page. If I click into one of these buttons, I can see all the CSS that is applied to this button. So what's even better is that we can open the DevTools in any website that we want. So we can actually open it in supersimple.dev, and you can see all the HTML that is on this website as well as all the CSS. So this is a really great tool where you can open it in any website that you want and see the exact styles that they're using on that website. The next feature I want to show you is this pointer icon in the top left. So instead of trying to find these buttons in all of this HTML, we can actually click this pointer icon and it will let us hover over any element on the web page and show it down here. So if we hover over this tweet button and click it, it will find the element for us in the HTML. And now we can look at these styles here to see what kind of styles and more importantly, what kind of background color is set on this button so that we can get a perfect background color. So one thing to note is that this background color is actually another way of measuring color. So currently we learned about RGB. Now we have another way of measuring color, and this is called hex. It's basically the same as RGB. The first two characters here, 1 and D, represent how much red, the second two represent how much green, and the third two represent how much blue. So with a little bit of math, we can convert from hex to RGB. So I just Google a hex to RGB calculator, and I find any calculator, and then I use it to convert the hex value. So I'm going to copy this into the calculator and then convert it, and it will give me the RGB value. So it'll do that math for me. So that's just another way of measuring color called hex. The next feature I want to show you in the DevTools is this Computed tab. So this tab actually shows us all the final styles that are applied to this element. So we can actually scroll down here and we can find the background color in the RGB value. We can also find things like the height, the final calculated height, the final calculated width, so that we can get the perfect size as well as the perfect background color. So let's actually just use the background color here. And we're going to copy this and paste this into our code. So we're going to get an exact color instead of trying to guess it like we were before. So if I copy and paste here, save it, and now I refresh, now our button has the exact same color as what we have here. So the same thing happens for the join button. Let's click this icon here and hover over the join button to find it in the HTML. Click, and now we can see all these styles, all the final computed styles on the join button. So most importantly, we can find the border color, which is this. Let's copy it and put it into our CSS so that we can get a perfect color. End it with a semicolon to follow the syntax rules. Okay, copy it there and copy it here. Now we're going to save, refresh, and now our button color is going to match the design exactly. So that's how you use the DevTools to get perfect color for our HTML elements. Now we're going to learn about the CSS box model, which basically allows us to add space between our elements like this, as well as add space inside our element to make it bigger. The first part of the box model is spacing on the outside of the element. This is called margin. If we look at our code, we already worked with margin before. Here we set the margin right to 8 pixels. That means that we added space on the outside of the button on the right of 8 pixels. If we change the margin right to 30 pixels, for example, and save and refresh, now there's 30 pixels of space on the outside on the right side of the button. So we can add margin to all 4 directions: top, right, bottom, and left. Let's try adding margin to the left side of the button this time. We're going to add margin left of 20 pixels. Save it and refresh. And that adds space on the outside of the button on the left of 20 pixels. So that's basically how margin works. It lets us add spacing on the outside of the element. The second part of the box model is spacing on the inside of the element. So basically all the spacing in here around our text. So currently, if we look at our code, we're setting the height and width of our buttons. And this is not actually a good idea. I'll show you why. I'm going to scroll down to the join button because it's a little easier to see. And I'm going to change the text to join my channel. Save it and refresh. And you'll notice that the text is actually overflowing the button like this. And that's because if we scroll up, we're setting the height and the width. That means that we're forcing the button to have a height of 36 pixels and a width of 62 pixels. But here, notice that our content is too big. So what we want to do is to remove these lines and save it and refresh the page. And by default, our button actually adjusts the size automatically based on the content. So now instead of setting the height and the width, we're going to achieve the same thing by adding spacing on the inside of the button. So the spacing on the inside of the button is called padding. Let's go into our code and give it a try. So we're going to add padding -left of 30 pixels. Save it and refresh. And you can see that padding adds spacing on the inside of the button. And just like margin, we can set padding in all 4 directions. So let's try adding padding -top to 20 pixels. Save that and refresh. And now you can see that we added padding on the top by 20 pixels. So we can actually use the Chrome Dev tools that we learned earlier to visualize the margin and padding of our elements. Let's go into a blank area of our webpage, and we're going to right click and inspect, and then click this top left icon, and then click our subscribe button. So I'm going to drag this down, and then we're going to go into the computed tab. So this section is basically the box model. We have our margin, which is the space on the outside of the element. You can see that highlighted in orange. We have the border, which we learned earlier, and we have the padding, which is the space on the inside of the element, which you can see highlighted in green. buttons by default have a padding of 6 pixels on the left and right, and 1 pixel on top and bottom. So let's click this top left again and go to our join button and click this button. In this example, we have padding on the top of 20 pixels, which is what we have in our code. We have padding on the left of 30 pixels, also what we have in our code. And then we have a default padding of 6 pixels on the right and 1 pixel at the bottom. And for this button, we have a border of 1 pixel wide, which you can see here in our code. So all of these combined make up the CSS box model. This basically determines how much space an element takes up on the page and how far it is away from other elements. So now that we learned the box model, we're going to use it to recreate our design here. So currently, if we look at our code, we're using height and width. Let's replace this with the box model. Let's get rid of this and save it and refresh. And now our button's back to what it was before. And now we're going to add padding to this button so that it matches the design at the bottom here. So let's add some padding dash top of 10 pixels. So we'll add spacing on the inside of the button at the top here of 10 pixels. We're also going to add padding dash bottom of 10 pixels. So let's save that and refresh. Okay, so now we have space at the top and bottom. So that looks pretty close. We're also going to add space on the inside on the left and right. So we're going to add padding dash left of 16 pixels and padding on the right of 16 pixels. So let's save that and refresh. And I think this looks close enough. So using padding, we added spacing on the inside of our button. And the good thing about this is that if we change the text like this and save it and refresh, the button will resize with the text, but it will keep the spacing on the inside. So using padding is a better alternative to height and width. So let's save that and refresh the page. And let's actually move these buttons back closer together. So currently, if we scroll up, we have margin on the right of 30 pixels. So spacing on the outside of the button on the right of 30 pixels. We're going to change it back to 8 pixels so that it's closer like we have in our design. Save it and refresh. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Now, one thing you'll notice is that our buttons are not aligned with each other. So the join button is all the way at the top, while our subscribe button is a little bit below. So why is this happening? By default, the browser tries to align our buttons based on the text. So notice that the text is in one line like this. So that's the default behavior of the browser. This is because browsers in the beginning were mostly text-based. Now to override this behavior and align everything to the top like we had before, we can go into our CSS and we're going to add a property called vertical-align. And we're going to set this to top. So instead of aligning the buttons based on the text like this, we're just going to align everything to the top. If we save that and refresh, now the subscribe button is aligned to the top, which is right there. Let's do the same thing for the tweet button. We're going to scroll down and we're going to add vertical-align top here as well. Save and refresh. And now everything's aligned properly again. Now let's work on the join button. I'm going to scroll down and remove this extra text here. Save it and refresh. And now we're going to go to our CSS for the join button. So I'll scroll up to right here and we're going to adjust the padding. So let's actually just borrow the padding from the subscribe button because they look pretty similar. So I'll scroll up here and copy these and just move them down to the join button right here. Save that and refresh. Okay, so that looks pretty good, except our join button looks a little bit off. It looks a little bit taller than our subscribe button. And that's because the border actually adds a little bit of size to this button. So it adds 1 pixel on the top and bottom. That's why this button is taller than the subscribe button. So to compensate, we're actually going to reduce the padding at the top and the bottom by 1 pixel. Save it and refresh. And now they're the same size. We have 9 pixels of space on the inside plus the 1 pixel of the border width. And that matches the 10 pixels of space on the inside of the subscribe button. And I'll leave changing the tweet button up to you as an exercise. So that is the CSS box model. Every element can have spacing on the outside called margin, space on the inside called padding, as well as a border. And these properties determine how much space an element takes up on the page. Here's some exercises of using the box model to get yourself more familiar with this concept and these properties. For most of the course, we've been working with buttons. In this lesson, we're going to work with text, and we're going to learn how to style text. So just like our button lesson, I've created an exercise that we can practice with text. So we're going to go to supersimple.dev/exercises/text. And now we have some text from YouTube and Apple that we're going to learn how to copy. So first of all, let's create a new HTML file where we can focus on practicing text styles. So I'm going to go here and create a new file. And let's just call this text.html. And now we're going to open this file in our browser. So open the folder that contains our code and right-click, open with Google Chrome. I'm actually going to put this up here. All right, so now we're ready to begin. If you've ever written a text document before using something like Google Docs or Microsoft Word, you've probably seen something like this. This is a toolbar that allows us to change the style of our text. We can change the font, the text size, we can make it bold, we can center it, etc. In CSS, we have a style for each of these things. Let's go to our code, and we're going to first start by creating some text on our page. So let's first create a paragraph. And then inside our paragraph, let's start with the text here. So I'm going to copy and paste this into our paragraph. And I'm just going to reorganize the code a little bit and save. Remember that in HTML, these extra spaces and new lines don't matter. Now refresh the page, and we have our first paragraph that we can practice with. Next, let's create a style element so we can write some CSS code. Now we'll set a class on this paragraph so that we can target it in CSS. Class equals video-title, because this is a video title that I copied from YouTube. So let's save it and refresh. And now we can start targeting this paragraph in our CSS. So remember, we're going to start with a dot to target a class, and we're going to target video-title. So the first thing we're going to change is the font. To change the font, the CSS property is font-family. So websites by default use the font called Times New Roman. We're going to change the font to a font called Arial. Save it and refresh. And now you can see we changed the font. Let's go to the next one. So this is the font size. And we can change the font size using the property font-size. And let's change it to something like 30 pixels. Save it and refresh. And now we have a bigger font. The next example is let's make it bold. We're going to go here and we're going to set the font-weight to be bold. Save it and refresh. And now we have bold font. So as you can see, CSS has properties for doing all of these things. And for most of these properties, it's pretty easy to Google them. For example, let's Google for how to make a font italic. So we'll go to Google and we just need to search something like CSS text italic. And now in the first result, we're going to go in here. And if you scroll down, you can see this CSS font style italic. So I'm going to copy this and paste it in my code, save it and refresh. And now we have italic text. The last one I'm going to show you for now is how to center this text, because in our exercise, we have an exercise where the text is centered. To center text, we're going to go to our code and we're going to type text-align. So this is the property for centering text or putting it to the left or to the right. Now we're going to give a value of center. Save it and refresh. And that's how we center our text. So that was pretty easy, right? Now let's go ahead and try to copy this style in our exercise. So if you remember, the general strategy for creating anything that we see is first create the element with HTML and then style it with CSS one by one. Let's go ahead and do that for this exercise. So I'm just going to resize this back, and we're going to start by resetting all of these styles. Save it and refresh. First, I'm going to start with the font family. So for this exercise, I actually use the font family Arial just to make it easier for us. So we're going to set the font-family to Arial. Save it and refresh. Next, I'm going to change the font weight. So this font is bold, and I want to make my font bold as well. So we're going to add font-weight bold. Save it and refresh. Next, let's change the font size. So I'm going to change this font size to something bigger, like maybe 20 pixels. Save it and refresh. And it looks a little too big compared to the design. So let's tone it down just a little bit, maybe 18 pixels. Save and refresh. Okay, so I think that looks close enough. Next, you'll notice that this text sort of wraps around to a second line, while ours doesn't. The way to make this happen is we're going to set a width on this title. Now, I know that in the previous section, we said it's bad to set a width, but here it's actually what we want. Because if we set a width, we're going to force the text onto a second line.
Have you ever struggled with overflowing elements or weird resizing behavior in CSS? More confident when approaching typical CSS problems like how to center a div or how can I make my website responsive with just a few lines of code? It all starts with HTML, where you have to define a reference point. This could be the body or a specific container that you use for your layout. Every HTML element that holds any type of content can be a flexbox or grid container. Our first goal is finding out how to align elements anywhere inside its parent element. At the top, bottom, left, right, center, and every combination in between. So we are going to answer the most popular beginner question, how to center a div. In HTML, we have these 5 div container boxes. They have some very basic styles in CSS. To align your boxes with a flexbox layout, you need to address the parent element. So we address the body and apply display flex. Notice how this immediately changed the way the boxes are positioned. They used to be one below the other, and now they are side by side. The display property is a very important CSS property. Most elements have a display of block or inline per default. Block elements take up the entire width of the screen. This results in elements being forced to the next line. When we apply display flex, we leave this system behind and enter a new world. Here, things work differently. Let's add a little border so that we can see the frame of our flexbox layout. The most important concepts in Flexbox are the axes along which items are positioned, the main axis and the cross axis. They control the flow of our Flexbox layout. To position your elements, you have to keep both of these axes in mind. Don't worry, I will keep showing them every once in a while. To position your elements anywhere along the main axis, you need the Justify Content property. This property has 3 basic values. Flex start is at the start of the main axis. This is the default value, which is why our boxes are here at the left side of our screen. Flex end is at the end of the main axis. This will align the boxes on the right side. And center is at the center of the main axis. So you can use these 2 lines of code, display flex and justify content center, to center your elements horizontally. By the way, this video is a free sample of our HTML and CSS complete course, so if you like the way we teach and you want to learn more about web development, then get the full course right now. Now let's see how we can align elements vertically. In this case, we need to consider the cross-axis. To do this, let's increase the size of the Flexbox layout by applying a min height of 800 pixels in the body. Now we can see that this black border is basically the frame of our Flexbox layout. To center your elements on the cross-axis, we use the Align Items property. This property can have the same values as Justify Content. So you have Flex Start for top positioning, meaning at the start of the cross-axis, Flex End for bottom positioning, now they are down here, and of course Center to put them in the center. And now we have finally answered how to center a div. You just need these 3 lines of code to center elements along the main and cross axis. Since Flexbox is flexible, this layout will work even if we change the size of the layout. The boxes will always be in the center, no matter if we change the height and width of the body. But Justify Content and Align Items can have 3 additional and more complex values: space between, space around, and space evenly. Space between will distribute the elements from left to right. The first and last element will touch the edge of the layout. Depending on how big the container is, the elements will have a bigger gap in between. Space around works similarly. But here the first and last element do not touch the edge. Instead, every element gets some space to the left and right. As you can see, even when I resize the entire website, the spacing between the elements adjusts automatically. But here we run into a slight inconsistency that just triggers my OCD. Since the right space of the box adds up with the left space of the second box, it will result in these spaces being twice as big as the spaces that we have to the edges. If you don't want that, you can use space evenly. Here all the spaces are the same size. And now finally the gaps are perfectly balanced, as all things should be. And of course, all of these values are completely flexible. They adjust perfectly when the size of the container changes. And that's the whole point of using Flexbox. Theoretically, you could achieve the same thing centering a div and positioning your elements using only margins and padding, but they are just not as flexible as a Flexbox layout. By the way, you can use the same values on the Align Items property as well. But in this case it wouldn't make sense, since we only have 1 row of content. The boxes will all just be at the start of the cross-axis. But it is possible to use these values on the cross-axis, as you will learn later once the layouts get more complex. For now, let's learn about another interesting Flexbox property, which is Flex Direction. To understand it easier, let's remove Align Items and just use Justify Content Flex Start for now. The Flex Direction property controls the direction of the main axis. Its default value is row, which makes the main axis go from left to right. You could also use row reverse to make it go from right to left. Looking at the numbers, we can see that it starts counting from the right. But this property also changed the way our Justify Content value works. Now, as the main axis goes from right to left, the value Flex Start is on the right side, and Flex End is on the left side. You can also make the main axis go from top to bottom by applying Flex Direction column. Now the elements are no longer side by side, but instead on top of each other. Since the direction of the main axis changed, the direction of the cross axis changed as well. Now if you want to center these boxes horizontally, you no longer use Justify Content, but instead Align Items. Since Justify Content aligns the elements on the main axis, which goes from top to bottom, it doesn't make sense now to use it. We need to use Align Items Center to center them on the cross axis. So I hope you understand that it is really important to remember the flex direction of your layout, as this completely changes the way all the other properties work. Per default, Flexbox uses a flex direction row. This will align the elements side by side. But you're also going to want to change it to flex direction column when you want your elements to be aligned vertically. Here is a very common use case scenario. You want your entire website to stay the same, everything is aligned vertically, but you also want to center everything horizontally. Then you would go to the body and apply display flex, flex direction, column, and align items, center. And with that, every element will automatically be centered horizontally. Alright, let's get back to our starting point, display flex. There are a few more simple Flexbox properties before it gets complicated. The gap property will create a gap between our items. This property is very simple and you no longer need to use margins inside a flexbox layout. For example, let's give our boxes a gap of 20 pixels. And as we can see, now every box has a nice little gap in between. The flex wrap property can make your flexbox layout responsive using only one line of code. You either have wrap or no wrap. If you use flex wrap, you will get a responsive layout that will align your items on the next line if we don't have enough space. Resizing the window will show how the elements flow to the next line when necessary. If you use flex wrap no wrap, that will not happen, and instead the boxes will shrink together. Using a flex wrap of wrap will make the elements flow to the next line. If we want this layout to be centered using justify content center and align item center, we end up with this layout. Why the gap between the first line and the second line is so big will become clear.
Pessoal, vou dormir, tá tarde já. Falou, até a próxima live.